In the depths of space, where civilizations measure their worth by the elegance of their mathematics and the purity of their theoretical knowledge, there exists a prestigious academy that has never admitted a human. For 3,000 years, the Convergence Institute has trained the galaxy's brightest minds, crystalline Vorthak, who think in geometric perfection, gaseous Nethys, who process information like living computers, and dozens of other species whose intellects are considered divine gifts to the universe. Then came the application that changed everything. Her name was inscribed in simple Earth script, Maya Chen. No prestigious bloodline, no mention of enhanced genetics, no indication of species superiority. Just a human who had fought in the Terran border wars, whose hands bore scars from emergency field repairs on dying starships, whose mind had been forged not in sterile laboratories but in the brutal crucible of survival. The admissions council laughed when they read her application. They had admitted her as a joke, a social experiment to see how badly a primitive human would fail among the galaxy's true intellectual elite. They expected her to wash out within weeks, providing them with amusing anecdotes about human limitations for centuries to come. They had no idea that humans don't just learn differently, they learn from everything. Every mistake, every failure, every moment when the universe tries to break them. They were about to discover why humanity had survived when countless, superior species had fallen to extinction. They were about to learn that there's a difference between intelligence that's given and intelligence that's earned through blood, sweat, and the absolute refusal to surrender. Maya Chen didn't know she was walking into a trap. She thought she was walking into the opportunity of a lifetime. She was right. Just not in the way anyone expected. The transport ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Maya Chen pressed her face against the viewport to get her first glimpse of the Convergence Institute. What she saw took her breath away. The academy wasn't built on a planet, it was a planet, artificially constructed in the shape of a perfect dodecahedron, each face containing entire continents of learning facilities. The structure rotated slowly in the void, its crystalline surfaces catching and refracting the light of 3 distant suns into rainbow patterns that would have been impossible to create naturally. Maya had seen wonders during her 8 years in the Terran Defense Corps. She'd watched stars being born in the Andromeda Spiral, witnessed the artificial rings of Kepler 442 that housed billions of beings, and flown through nebulae that painted space in colors that had no names. But this was different. This wasn't just impressive, it was a statement, a declaration that whoever built this place possessed knowledge so advanced that they could reshape reality itself. She pulled her worn military duffel bag closer and checked her admission documents for the 100th time. The holographic seal of the Institute still seemed impossible. Maya Chen, former sergeant, Terran Defense Corps, 47th Engineering Battalion, admitted to the Convergence Institute for Advanced Cosmic Studies. When the acceptance message had arrived at the Veteran Rehabilitation Center on Mars, half the staff thought it was a cruel practical joke. The other passengers on the transport gave her a wide berth, their various alien forms clustering in small groups while whispering in languages that ranged from melodious chimes to complex mathematical equations. Maya didn't need a translator to understand their meaning. They all wondered what the primitive human was doing on a ship bound for the most prestigious academy in the galaxy. A young Vorthak, its crystalline body reflecting the light from the Institute in prismatic patterns, approached her with what might have been curiosity. The Vorthaks were living geometric forms, their consciousness existing in the mathematical relationships between their crystal facets. This one appeared to be roughly her age, though with Vorthaks, age was measured in computational cycles rather than years. "You are the human applicant," the Vorthak said, its voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I am designated geometric harmony of the 7th sphere, though your species' linguistic limitations may require a shorter designation." "Maya," she replied, extending her hand before remembering that Vorthaks didn't have hands to shake. She let it drop awkwardly. "And yes, I'm the human. Probably the only one you'll ever see at the Institute. Indeed. My calculations suggest the probability of human academic success at the Institute approaches 0.0003%, with a margin of error that still rounds to 0. The Vorthak's crystal surface shifted colors, which Maya guessed was their equivalent of a shrug. "I am curious to observe this statistical impossibility firsthand." Maya forced herself to smile. She'd dealt with worse than casual dismissal during the war. At least this crystal being wasn't actively shooting at her. Well, I've beaten worse odds before. Fascinating. In what context? Staying alive, Maya said simply. The Vorthax crystal stopped shifting, its entire form becoming perfectly still, in the mathematical language of its species. Complete stillness was the equivalent of surprise so profound that all calculations temporarily ceased. Maya didn't know this, but she noticed the sudden silence that fell over the nearby alien students. The transport shuddered again as it approached the Institute's docking bay. Maya gathered her belongings and prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging experience of her life. The war had taught her that the universe was full of things that wanted to kill you. But at least in war, the goals were simple. Complete the mission, protect your squad, stay alive. Here, she wasn't even sure what the mission was. The docking bay was a marvel of engineering that made Earth's largest spaceports look like small-town airports. The ceiling curved away into impossible distances, and the floors were made of what looked like liquid mercury that somehow maintained perfect stability. Hundreds of different species moved through the space with purpose, their various forms creating a symphony of diversity that boggled the mind. Maya followed the flow of new students toward what her admission packet indicated was the orientation area. The packet itself was another marvel printed on some kind of smart material that adjusted its language and symbols based on who was reading it. When she looked at it, the text was in clear English, but she'd seen it shift into crystalline patterns when the Vorthak had glanced at it. The orientation amphitheater was vast enough to hold several thousand beings, with seating areas adapted for dozens of different physiologies. Maya found a section marked for humanoid species and settled into a chair that automatically adjusted to her body shape. Around her, the other new students were settling in, some floating in energy fields, others coiled in specialized rest positions, a few that seemed to exist as patterns of light hovering above their designated spaces. The orientation began without fanfare. A figure appeared on the central platform, or rather, a collection of figures that somehow existed as one being. The Nethys were communal intelligences, their individual components looking like wisps of colored gas that constantly moved in and out of a central form. When they spoke, their voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, new students, to the Convergence Institute," the Nethys said. "You represent the finest intellects from across the galaxy, selected through rigorous testing that measures not just knowledge, but the capacity to transcend the limitations of your species' evolutionary development." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Transcend limitations. She wondered if anyone here understood what limitations really looked like. She thought of Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd held a breach in their ship's hull with his bare hands until the emergency patches could be applied, dying in the process but saving the lives of 43 crew members. She thought of Engineer Patel, who'd figured out how to rewire a damaged hyperdrive using spare parts from a food processor while enemy fire rained down around them. "Your studies here will challenge every assumption you hold about the nature of reality," the Nethys continued. "You will learn to think beyond the crude limitations of matter and energy, to perceive the underlying mathematical structures that govern all existence. Some of you will fail. This is not merely possible, it is inevitable. The universe does not yield its secrets to minds that remain trapped in primitive thinking patterns." The various alien students around Maya seemed to straighten with pride at these words. They'd been told they were special their entire lives, that their species' particular gifts made them natural scholars of cosmic truth. Maya had been told she was expendable, that humans were useful primarily for their ability to survive in situations that would kill more advanced beings. She was beginning to understand that this might be exactly the advantage she needed. The Nethys gestured to floating displays that materialized around the amphitheater. "Your course schedules have been individually optimized based on your species' cognitive strengths. Each student will follow a path designed to maximize their potential while minimizing exposure to concepts that might prove overwhelming." Maya's display showed her schedule, and her heart sank. Remedial mathematics for non-computational species, basic physics for primitive civilizations, introduction to elementary logic systems. She was being placed in what were essentially kindergarten classes, while the other students around her were looking at courses with titles like Advanced Quantum Consciousness Theory and Multi-Dimensional Ethical Frameworks. A soft chime indicated that the orientation was ending. Students are advised to spend the next several solar cycles familiarizing themselves with the Institute's basic systems, the Nethys announced. Academic instruction begins when the local star reaches its fourth solar position. Failure to report to your assigned classes will result in immediate expulsion, as will any behavior that disrupts the learning environment. As the other students began to disperse, Maya remained in her seat, staring at her course schedule. She'd survived ambushes by Rieger pirates, held together failing life support systems with improvised repairs, and once spent 3 days jury-rigging a communication array from the wreckage of 2 destroyed ships. But looking at this schedule made her feel smaller than she'd felt since her first day of basic training. The Vorthak from the transport ship approached her again. "I observe that you appear distressed. Is this emotional state related to your academic assignments?" "They put me in the slow classes," Maya said, not bothering to hide her disappointment. "I didn't fight my way through military engineering courses just to take basic physics for dummies. The Institute's placement algorithms are highly sophisticated." The Vorthak replied, "They analyze not merely your submitted academic records, but perform deep scans of your neural patterns to determine optimal learning paths. If you have been placed in fundamental courses, it is because your mind lacks the structural capacity for more advanced concepts." Maya stood up, her jaw clenched. "My mind lacks the structural capacity? Let me tell you something about structural capacity. I once rebuilt a fusion reactor while my ship was tumbling through a debris field and enemy fighters were using us for target practice. I improvised a gravity generator from medical equipment and spare hull plating. I've solved problems that your sophisticated algorithms have probably never even considered." The Vorthak's crystals began cycling through rapid color changes, what Maya was beginning to recognize as their version of excitement. "Fascinating. These examples suggest practical application of advanced theoretical principles, yet your academic records indicate no formal training in quantum mechanics or gravitational theory." "Because I learned it by doing it," Maya said. "We didn't have time for theory when people's lives were on the line." "Extraordinary. You appear to have developed intuitive understanding of complex systems through empirical experimentation rather than mathematical derivation. This approach is considered highly inefficient by conventional academic standards." Maya gathered her belongings and slung her duffel bag over her shoulder. "Maybe. But it kept us alive when conventional academic standards would have gotten us killed." As she walked toward the exit, Maya could feel hundreds of alien eyes tracking her movement. Some seemed curious, others dismissive. A few appeared almost predatory, as if they were already anticipating the entertainment value of watching her fail. She'd been in hostile territory before. The difference was that in war, you knew who your enemies were. Here, she wasn't even sure if she had allies. Her assigned dormitory was in Section 7G, which according to her map was designated for students requiring basic atmospheric conditions and primitive sanitation facilities. The corridor leading to her room was notably smaller and less ornate than the main academic areas, with simple metal walls instead of the flowing artistic surfaces she'd seen elsewhere in the institute. Maya's room was Spartan but functional. A bed, a desk, a small area for personal belongings, and a bathroom that looked almost normal by human standards. The window offered a view of one of the institute's garden sectors, where she could see what looked like forests of crystalline trees and meadows of flowing light grass. She unpacked her few belongings quickly. Her military gear took up most of the space: a portable toolkit, emergency rations, a field repair manual that had saved her life more times than she could count, and a small photo of her engineering squad from before the war had scattered them across the galaxy. As she was organizing her tools, her room's communication system chimed. A holographic display appeared showing an elegant alien form she didn't recognize, humanoid but tall and ethereal, with skin that seemed to shift between silver and blue. "Maya Chen," the figure said, its voice carrying a musical quality that somehow managed to sound condescending. "I am Academic Coordinator HFY of the Etherian Collective. I have been assigned to oversee your integration into the Institute's academic program." "Nice to meet you," Maya said, though something in the coordinator's tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "I have reviewed your placement evaluations, and I must express some concern about your presence here. The Institute's reputation is built on academic excellence, and admitting students who lack the fundamental cognitive framework for advanced learning can compromise our educational environment." Maya set down the tool she'd been organizing and faced the hologram directly. "Are you suggesting I don't belong here? I am suggesting that perhaps alternative educational paths might better serve your particular limitations." The Institute maintains several vocational training programs that might prove more suitable for beings of your cognitive level. Vocational training, maintenance, food service, basic custodial operations, honest work that doesn't require the intellectual rigor expected of our regular students. Maya was quiet for a long moment, remembering similar conversations she'd had with officers who thought enlisted personnel weren't smart enough to understand complex systems. She'd proven them wrong then by keeping their ships running when their theories fell apart under real-world conditions. "Coordinator HFY," she said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be surprised by what I'm capable of." The hologram's expression didn't change. "Miss Chen, I have overseen the education of students from 47 different species across 3 centuries. I have observed the limits of various forms of intelligence, and I can recognize when those limits have been reached. I am trying to save you from the embarrassment of public failure. That's very thoughtful of you, but I'll stick with my current course load." HFY's image flickered slightly, which Maya guessed was the holographic equivalent of a sigh. "Very well. However, I want to be clear about the Institute's expectations. You will be required to maintain the same academic standards as all other students. There will be no special accommodations for your species' cognitive limitations. When you fail to meet these standards, and statistical analysis suggests this failure is inevitable, you will be expelled immediately." The hologram disappeared, leaving Maya alone in her small room. She looked out the window at the alien gardens, where creatures she couldn't identify were tending to plants that defied everything she thought she knew about botany. Maya had always been good at finding patterns, at seeing how systems worked by watching them function. It was a skill that had made her an exceptional engineer and had kept her alive through situations that should have killed her. Looking at the Institute now, she was beginning to see a pattern that none of its sophisticated inhabitants seemed to recognize. They were all so focused on proving how intelligent they were that they'd forgotten why intelligence mattered in the first place. They were studying the universe like it was a museum exhibit, something to be observed and categorized and admired from a safe distance. Maya had learned about the universe by wrestling with it, by making it work when it didn't want to, by refusing to let it kill her or the people she cared about. Maybe that wasn't the same as understanding its mathematical elegance, but it was something these aliens had never experienced. She unpacked her field repair manual and set it on her desk next to the Institute's study materials. The contrast was striking. The Institute's materials were works of art, beautiful holographic displays that responded to thought and adapted themselves to the reader's learning style. Her manual was a battered physical book, its pages stained with grease and marked with handwritten notes in the margins. One of these had been created by the galaxy's finest minds to represent the pinnacle of educational design. The other had been written by practical engineers who needed information that would work when everything else was falling apart. Maya opened her course schedule again and really studied it this time. Remedial mathematics for non-computational species was taught by Professor Kethvar, a being whose species was known for their ability to perform calculations that would challenge supercomputers. Basic physics for primitive civilizations was overseen by Dr. Nelthy, whose people had achieved spaceflight when Earth was still covered in ice. They were going to teach her the basics, the fundamentals, the simple, obvious stuff that every educated being in the galaxy took for granted. Maya smiled for the first time since arriving at the Institute. In her experience, the basics were where you found the real secrets. When systems failed, when theories broke down, when all the sophisticated solutions stopped working, you went back to the fundamentals and built something that actually functioned. Maybe these professors thought they were placing her in remedial classes as a kindness, or maybe they thought they were setting her up to fail quietly. Either way, they were about to give her something she'd never had before, the chance to really understand the foundational principles that more advanced students skipped over in their rush to reach esoteric concepts. She thought about Sergeant Rodriguez again, holding that hull breach until the patches were ready. He hadn't known the advanced theories of atmospheric pressure dynamics or metal stress analysis. He'd just known that if he let go, people would die. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution was the one that worked. Maya closed her course schedule and picked up her repair manual. She had 3 days before classes started. 3 days to prepare for whatever these alien professors thought would overwhelm her primitive human mind. She'd been underestimated before. It rarely ended well for the beings doing the underestimating. Maya's first class was remedial mathematics for non-computational species, held in a chamber that looked more like a temple than a classroom. The walls curved in impossible ways that hurt to look at directly, covered in symbols that shifted and changed as she watched. Professor Kethvar stood at the center of the room, its form a constantly shifting geometric pattern that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Maya's eyes could process. The other students in the class were a mixed group, mostly beings from species that were considered intellectually gifted in other areas but mathematically limited. A melodic whose people thought in pure music, a Verdanian whose plant-based consciousness operated on seasonal cycles rather than discrete calculations, and several others that Maya couldn't immediately identify. Mathematics, Professor Kethvar began, its voice like crystalline chimes arranged in perfect harmonic progression, is the fundamental language of reality. Every force, every interaction, every possibility that exists can be expressed through mathematical relationships. Today, we begin with the most basic concept, the nature of numbers themselves. Maya had expected something simple: addition, subtraction, maybe basic algebra. Instead, Professor Kethvar immediately launched into a discussion of number theory that would have challenged graduate students at Earth's best universities. The professor was treating remedial mathematics the way a human might treat quantum mechanics. "Observe," Kethvar said. And symbols appeared in the air, not holographic projections, but actual symbols that existed in three-dimensional space and could be manipulated by touch. The number 7. To most primitive species, this is merely a counting increment, but 7 possesses inherent mathematical properties that determine its relationship to the fundamental structures of space-time. The melodic student raised what might have been a hand it was hard to tell with beings that looked like living sound waves. "Professor, when you say fundamental structures of space-time, do you mean that numbers exist independently of consciousness, or that consciousness creates mathematical relationships as a survival adaptation?" Maya blinked. That was supposed to be a remedial question. The melodic was casually discussing concepts that Earth's philosophers had debated for centuries. "An excellent inquiry," Kethvar replied. "Mathematical relationships exist independently, but consciousness is the mechanism through which the universe becomes aware of its own structure. 7, for example, appears in the harmonic resonances that govern stellar formation, the crystalline matrices that determine molecular bonding, and the wave patterns that establish the boundaries between dimensions." Maya raised her hand, feeling completely out of her depth. "Professor, could you explain what you mean by wave patterns that establish boundaries between dimensions? I'm not sure I understand the basic concept." The room fell silent. Maya could feel every alien eye turning toward her, and the quality of their attention was unmistakably pitying. The human was already lost, and they hadn't even finished discussing the number 7. Professor Kethvar's geometric form shifted into what Maya was beginning to recognize as a pattern of patient condescension. "Perhaps we should begin with more fundamental concepts. Can you tell me, Miss Chen, what you understand a dimension to be?" Quote, Maya thought about the repair manual in her room, about the practical geometry she'd used to calculate stress loads and structural modifications during the war. "A dimension is a direction you can move in space. Length, width, height. We live in 3 spatial dimensions plus time, adequate for primitive applications," Kethvar acknowledged. "However, reality operates in 11 spatial dimensions, with time existing as a complex matrix, rather than a simple, linear progression. The boundaries between these dimensions are maintained by standing wave patterns that oscillate at frequencies determined by prime number relationships." Maya's head was spinning. She'd thought she had a decent grasp of mathematics and physics from her engineering background. But this was like trying to drink from a fire hose. Worse, the other remedial students were nodding along as if this made perfect sense. The Verdanian spoke up, its voice like wind through leaves. "Professor, does this mean that prime numbers are essentially dimensional anchors, preventing the collapse of higher-order space into our observable 3 dimensions?" "Precisely," Kethvar replied. "And this is why 7 is significant. It appears as a stabilizing factor in the wave equations that maintain dimensional separation. Without prime number relationships, the universe would exist as an undifferentiated, multi-dimensional void." Maya frantically scribbled notes, trying to keep up with concepts that seemed to redraw the laws of physics every few minutes. She'd always thought mathematics was about calculation, about solving practical problems. Here, mathematics was apparently the fundamental structure of existence itself. After an hour of increasingly complex discussion about the metaphysical properties of basic arithmetic, Professor Kethvar assigned homework that made Maya's stomach drop. For tomorrow, I want each of you to calculate the dimensional resonance factors for the first 50 prime numbers, showing how they relate to the stability of local space-time. This should be a simple review exercise. Simple review. Maya stared at her notes, which looked like someone had taken higher-order calculus and mixed it with mystical philosophy. Half the symbols the professor had used didn't exist in Earth mathematics, and the other half apparently meant something completely different than what human mathematicians thought they meant. As the class ended, the melodic student approached her. "You seem distressed," it said, its musical voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. "Are you experiencing difficulty with the fundamental concepts?" "I think I might be in over my head," Maya admitted. "I thought this was supposed to be remedial." "Oh, it is," the melodic replied cheerfully. Professor Kethvar is known for making basic concepts accessible to species with limited mathematical intuition. In the regular mathematics courses, students are expected to intuitively grasp concepts like dimensional manipulation and reality restructuring. Here, the professor actually explains the underlying principles. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. If this was the simplified version, what did the regular courses look like? Her next class was Basic Physics for Primitive Civilizations, taught by Dr. Nelthe in a laboratory that seemed to exist in several different gravitational fields simultaneously. Students could walk on the walls, ceiling, or any other surface depending on where they chose to orient themselves. Maya stuck to what she hoped was the floor and tried not to think about the physics involved. Dr. Nelthe was a quantum collective, a species that existed as probability clouds until they chose to observe themselves into specific states. When teaching, Dr. Nelthe appeared as a roughly humanoid figure made of shifting light patterns, but Maya could see the edges where the being blurred into quantum uncertainty. Physics, Dr. Nelthe began, is the study of how consciousness interacts with matter to create the illusion of objective reality. Today, we will examine the most basic physical principle, the relationship between observation and existence. Maya had studied physics in her military training, but it had been practical physics how to calculate trajectories, understand energy transfers, predict structural failures. This sounded more like philosophy. "Can anyone tell me," Dr. Nelthe continued, "what happens to matter when it is not being observed?" A student that looked like a small star raised a plasma appendage. "It exists in quantum superposition, maintaining all possible states simultaneously until observation collapses it into a single reality." "Correct. And why does observation have this effect?" Another student answered. "Because consciousness is the universal force that transforms potential into actuality. Without consciousness to observe it, matter has no reason to choose specific properties." Maya raised her hand. "I'm sorry, but are you saying that reality doesn't exist unless someone is looking at it?" The class went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not pity, but genuine confusion. Dr. Nelthe's probability cloud flickered as the being tried to understand Maya's question. "Miss Chen," Dr. Nelthe said finally, "reality is the interaction between consciousness and quantum potential. Matter exists as probability until observation defines its specific characteristics. This is fundamental physics. But what about things that happen when nobody's watching? If a star explodes in an empty region of space, does it not explode until someone observes the light reaching them?" Dr. Nelthe's form became more solid, which Maya was learning meant intense concentration. "You appear to be thinking of matter as existing independently of consciousness. This is a common misconception among primitive species who have not yet developed quantum awareness." Maya felt her temper rising. "On Earth, we call that objective reality. Things exist whether we're looking at them or not. A rock doesn't stop being a rock just because nobody's around." "But how do you know?" Dr. Nelthe asked, and Maya could hear what sounded like genuine curiosity. "You can only verify the existence of the rock when you observe it. At all other times, you are simply assuming it maintains consistent properties, because if reality constantly changed based on who was looking at it, nothing would work consistently. Engineering would be impossible. You couldn't build anything reliable," the stellar student interjected. "But that is precisely why advanced physics requires consciousness manipulation. We learn to maintain consistent observations to stabilize local reality for practical applications. Maya's head was pounding. According to these beings, physics wasn't about discovering natural laws, it was about learning to think reality into stable configurations. They were treating the universe like a collaborative hallucination that required constant mental maintenance. Dr. Nell assigned homework that involved practicing basic reality stabilization techniques and maintaining consistent matter observation patterns. Maya had no idea what either of those things meant, but she wrote them down anyway. Her third class was Introduction to Elementary Logic Systems, which Maya had hoped would be more familiar territory. Logic was logic, right? Either something made sense or it didn't. Professor Verith was a crystalline sage, a being that existed as living mathematics embodied in geometric crystal form. The classroom was a perfect sphere with no obvious floor or ceiling, and students arranged themselves in three-dimensional patterns around the central teaching space. Logic, Professor Verith began, is the art of reaching truth through systematic reasoning. However, truth itself is dependent on the logical framework being employed. Today, we will examine the 17 basic logical systems used throughout galactic civilization. 17 basic systems? Maya had learned classical logic: true, false, if-then, cause, and effect. How many different ways could there be to reason about things? Professor Vereth displayed a series of statements in three-dimensional text that hung in the air. Consider the following proposition: all quantum butterflies are blue. In standard logic, this is either true or false. In probability logic, this statement has a numerical truth value between 0 and 1. In temporal logic, it may be true at some times and false at others. In observer logic, its truth depends on who is making the observation and from what perspective. Maya raised her hand. Professor, how can the same statement have different truth values? Either all quantum butterflies are blue, or they aren't. Professor Verith's crystalline form shifted into a pattern that Maya was beginning to recognize as patient explanation mode. Miss Chen, you are thinking in binary logic, which recognizes only two possible states. This is adequate for very simple systems, but reality operates on multiple logical levels simultaneously. But if something can be both true and false at the same time, how do you ever reach any conclusions? By selecting the appropriate logical framework for the question being examined. Professor Verith replied. For example, in emotional logic, truth is determined by the psychological satisfaction provided by different conclusions. In aesthetic logic, truth corresponds to elegance and beauty. In survival logic, truth is defined by which beliefs promote continued existence. Maya felt like she was drowning. So truth is just whatever you decide it is. The other students were looking at her with something approaching alarm. A being that looked like a mobile tree spoke up. Miss Chen, truth is the convergence of multiple logical frameworks toward consistent conclusions. We use different logical systems to examine different aspects of complex problems, but there has to be some objective standard, Maya insisted. Some way to determine what's actually real. Professor Verith's crystals went completely still, that expression of profound surprise she'd seen before. Miss Chen, you appear to believe in absolute truth, the concept that reality has inherent, discoverable properties that exist independent of the observer and logical framework used to examine them. This is a quaint historical perspective. It's not historical, Maya said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. It's engineering. When I'm fixing a broken reactor, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The reactor doesn't care about my logical framework or my perspective. It either works or it doesn't. The classroom fell into complete silence. Maya could see the other students exchanging glances that clearly communicated shared bewilderment. Professor Verith's crystalline form began cycling through rapid pattern changes, what Maya was beginning to recognize as deep computational processing. Miss Chen, Professor Verith said finally, you are describing applied truth, the use of specific logical frameworks to achieve consistent results in limited contexts. This is indeed effective for simple mechanical problems, but breaks down completely when dealing with complex systems or abstract concepts. Maya wanted to argue, to point out that simple mechanical problems included keeping starships functional in combat situations and preventing fusion reactors from turning planets into radioactive slag. but she could see that she was already being dismissed as too primitive to understand sophisticated concepts. The homework assignment was to solve the same problem using 5 different logical frameworks and explain why each solution was equally valid. Maya stared at the assignment and realized she was fundamentally lost. That night, Maya sat in her room surrounded by homework that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. She was supposed to calculate dimensional resonance factors using mathematics that included imaginary numbers she'd never heard of, practice reality stabilization techniques that seemed to involve meditation and mental exercises, and solve logic problems that had multiple correct answers depending on which system of reasoning she chose to employ. This wasn't education, it was an exercise in accepting that everything she thought she knew was wrong. Maya opened her field repair manual and looked at a schematic for emergency hyperdrive repairs. The diagram showed exactly which components needed to be connected in exactly which way to create a functioning system. There was no discussion of multiple logical frameworks or observer-dependent reality. The hyperdrive worked according to specific principles, or it didn't work at all. She thought about her engineering squad during the war, working 18-hour shifts to keep damaged ships operational, while enemy forces hunted them through asteroid fields. They hadn't had time for 17 different logical systems or reality stabilization meditation. They'd had problems that needed solving, and lives that depended on getting the solutions right. But looking at her homework assignments, Maya began to see something the Institute's professors had missed. They were teaching these concepts as if they were separate, unrelated subjects, mathematics, physics, and logic, as distinct disciplines that happened to share some theoretical overlap. Maya had learned to think of them as parts of the same system. Mathematics was the language you used to describe how physics worked, and logic was the method you used to make sure your mathematics actually solved real problems. They weren't separate subjects, they were tools that worked together to help you understand and manipulate reality. Maybe that was what she was missing. Maybe the Institute's approach wasn't wrong, just incomplete. These alien students were learning to think about the universe in incredibly sophisticated ways, but they were thinking about it like philosophers and theoreticians rather than engineers. Maya pulled out a piece of paper and started working on her mathematics homework. But instead of trying to understand dimensional resonance as an abstract concept, she approached it like an engineering problem. If dimensions were directions you could move in space, and if resonance was what happened when frequencies matched up to create amplification, then dimensional resonance might be about how movement in higher dimensions could amplify or dampen effects in lower dimensions. It was probably wrong according to Professor Kethvar's sophisticated understanding, but it was a starting point Maya could work with. She began to translate the alien mathematics into concepts she could grasp, building up from practical applications toward the theoretical framework. For her physics homework, she tried to think of observation not as consciousness creating reality, but as consciousness gathering information about reality. Maybe the act of observation didn't change what existed, but changed what the observer could know about what existed. The rock was always there, but looking at it provided data that the observer could use to understand the rock's properties. Again, probably wrong by Dr. Nelthy's standards, but it gave Maya a way to approach problems that made sense according to her understanding of how the universe worked. The logic homework was the hardest, because Maya couldn't shake the conviction that some answers were more correct than others. But she started to think about the different logical systems as different tools, each useful for specific types of problems, but not necessarily applicable to every situation. You wouldn't use a hammer to perform surgery, and you wouldn't use a scalpel to drive a nail. Maybe logical frameworks were similar, specialized tools for specialized problems. By the time she finished her homework, Maya had filled a dozen pages with notes that probably looked primitive compared to what her classmates were producing. But for the first time since arriving at the Institute, she felt like she understood what she was trying to learn, even if her understanding was completely different from what her professors expected. Maya closed her books and looked out the window at the alien gardens. Tomorrow she would turn in homework that approached galactic civilization's most advanced concepts from the perspective of a human engineer who had learned to think while under fire. Her professors would probably mark it as inadequate. Her classmates would continue to see her as a curiosity. And academic coordinator HFY would have more evidence that humans didn't belong at the Institute. But Maya had survived situations where being wrong meant death, and she'd learned to trust her instincts about what worked and what didn't. Right now, her instincts were telling her that something was missing from the Institute's approach to understanding reality, something important that their sophisticated theories couldn't quite capture. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she was determined to find out. Maya's first week at the Institute passed in a blur of incomprehensible lectures and homework assignments that required her to relearn everything she thought she knew about reality. Her professors treated her attempts to apply practical engineering logic to theoretical problems with the kind of patient condescension usually reserved for small children trying to explain complex adult situations. Professor Kethvar had returned her mathematics homework with a note that read, "While your approach shows resourcefulness, you cannot simply ignore 11-dimensional topology in favor of 3-dimensional approximations. Please review the fundamental principles before attempting future assignments." Dr. Nelthe had written, "Your persistent belief in observer-independent reality indicates a need for consciousness expansion exercises. I recommend meditation on the illusory nature of matter." Professor Verath had simply marked her logic homework as incomplete, noting that her insistence on binary logic frameworks made it impossible to evaluate her reasoning according to accepted academic standards. Maya was beginning to understand that the Institute operated on the assumption that human thought patterns were not just different from galactic standards, but fundamentally inferior. Her professors weren't trying to help her learn, they were waiting for her to either abandon her human way of thinking or wash out gracefully. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning during her advanced quantum consciousness class, the one class where she'd been allowed to audit despite her primitive academic placement. Maya had requested permission to sit in on lectures just to observe, and Professor Zinthai had agreed with the kind of amused tolerance one might show for a pet wanting to watch its owner work. Professor Zinthai was a being of pure energy contained within a complex geometric field that served as its body. The class was held in a chamber where physical matter was optional. Most of the students existed as consciousness patterns floating in space, occasionally manifesting material forms when they needed to manipulate the learning environment. "Today," Professor Zinthai announced, "we will examine the practical applications of consciousness engineering. Specifically, how advanced beings can modify local reality through focused mental intention." Maya watched in fascination as the students began demonstrating their abilities. A crystalline being restructured the atomic bonds in a piece of metal, changing it from iron to gold through what appeared to be concentrated thought. A nebula consciousness created complex gravitational fields that bent light into impossible patterns. A quantum entity reached into parallel dimensions and retrieved objects that didn't exist in their current reality. "Miss Chen," Professor Zinthai called out, "since you are observing, perhaps you would like to attempt a simple consciousness manipulation exercise." Maya felt every eye in the class turn toward her. She was clearly being set up for humiliation, the primitive human trying to perform feats that required millennia of evolutionary development. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to do," Maya said carefully. "Something simple," Professor Zinthai replied. "Perhaps alter the crystalline structure of this metallic sample, or modify the local gravitational field. Choose whatever seems within your capabilities." Maya approached the demonstration area, where a chunk of ordinary-looking metal sat on what appeared to be a floating platform. Around her, the other students watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for amusing failures. She could practically hear them thinking, "Watch the human try to move matter with her mind." Maya picked up the metal sample and examined it closely. It was some kind of alloy she didn't recognize, but her engineering experience let her identify stress patterns in the crystalline structure. The material was flawed. There were microscopic fractures that would lead to catastrophic failure under pressure. "Professor," she said, "this sample has structural weaknesses that make it unsuitable for any practical application. The crystalline matrix has been compromised, probably during the original manufacturing process. That is irrelevant to the exercise," Professor Zinthai replied dismissively. "We are studying consciousness manipulation, not primitive metallurgy. But if you're trying to modify the atomic structure, these flaws will interfere with any changes you try to make. The instabilities will propagate through whatever new configuration you create." The class fell silent. Professor Zinthai's energy form flickered with what Maya was beginning to recognize as irritation. "Miss Chen, your human perceptions cannot detect quantum-level structural flaws that would concern advanced consciousness manipulation." Maya turned the metal sample to catch the light from different angles, revealing hairline cracks that were invisible unless you knew how to look for them. "Actually, you can see the stress patterns if you examine the way light reflects off the crystal boundaries. Look here." She traced a line across the surface with her finger. This fracture line runs through the entire sample. Any attempt to restructure the atomic bonds will cause the material to shatter along this plane. One of the students, a being that looked like a small galaxy complete with spiral arms, drifted closer to examine the metal. Fascinating. I do detect quantum instabilities along the indicated trajectory. How did you perceive these flaws without consciousness extension? You look for the patterns, Maya said simply. Materials fail in predictable ways. Once you understand the principles, you can identify potential problems before they become critical. Professor Zinthai's form stabilized into a more solid configuration. What Maya was learning meant focused attention. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that physical examination can reveal quantum-level structural information? I'm suggesting that you don't need consciousness manipulation to understand how matter behaves. You just need to understand the physics involved. Maya set the metal sample back down and picked up another piece from the demonstration collection. This one was structurally sound, with a clean crystalline matrix that could handle significant modification without failing. This sample would be much better for consciousness manipulation experiments, she said. The atomic bonds are stable, the crystalline structure is uniform, and there are no stress concentrations that would interfere with restructuring. The galaxy-shaped student performed what Maya assumed was some kind of consciousness extension technique, then rippled with patterns that might have been surprise. The human is correct. This sample demonstrates significantly greater quantum stability than the original selection. Professor Zinthai examined both samples using methods that made the air around them shimmer with visible energy. After several minutes of analysis, the professor's form underwent rapid configuration changes that Maya was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of confusion. Miss Chen, Professor Zinthai said finally, your analysis is accurate. The original sample contains quantum instabilities that would indeed interfere with consciousness-based molecular restructuring. How did you determine this through purely physical examination? Maya thought about how to explain metallurgical analysis to a being that could manipulate matter with its thoughts. Materials have properties that you can observe and measure. Stress patterns, crystal boundaries, fracture lines, they're all visible if you know what to look for. I learned to identify these patterns because in combat situations, you need to know which components will fail under stress and which ones will hold. But such analysis requires extensive sensor equipment and computational modeling. Another student objected. How can biological perception detect quantum-level flaws? Because quantum-level flaws have macro-scale effects, Maya replied. The microscopic fractures affect how light reflects off the surface. The stress patterns alter the way the material responds to temperature changes. You don't have to see individual atoms to understand how they're behaving. Professor Zinthai was cycling through rapid configuration changes. What Maya was now certain was deep processing of unexpected information. Miss Chen, you appear to be describing a form of intuitive physics that allows prediction of quantum behavior through observation of emergent patterns. I guess. I just call it engineering. The class spent the next hour examining various material samples, with Maya identifying structural problems that the other students' consciousness scanning abilities had missed. It turned out that while advanced beings could manipulate matter at the quantum level, they relied entirely on mental techniques to understand its properties. They'd never developed the kind of observational analysis that human engineers took for granted. After the class ended, the galaxy-shaped student approached Maya. I am Spiral Harmony of Ancient Light, and I am perplexed by what we observe today. Your species appears to possess analytical capabilities that our theoretical framework suggests should be impossible. What do you mean? Consciousness manipulation requires extensive mental preparation and energy expenditure to perceive quantum-level phenomena. You accomplished similar analysis through passive observation. This suggests your brain operates according to principles we do not understand. Maya tried to think of how to explain pattern recognition and experience-based analysis to a being that lived as organized cosmic energy. It's not that mysterious. Humans are good at spotting patterns because we had to be. Our ancestors survived by noticing when something in their environment was wrong. Predators, dangerous weather, contaminated food. We evolved to be paranoid about structural problems. Extraordinary, Spiral Harmony said. You are describing survival-based intuition as a form of quantum analysis. This suggests that environmental pressure can produce analytical capabilities equivalent to technological enhancement. That afternoon, news of Maya's unexpected success in Professor Zinthai's class had spread throughout the institute. Maya found herself approached by students from various species, all curious about human analytical methods. Most seemed to view her as an interesting anomaly, a primitive being that had accidentally developed useful tricks. The attention was uncomfortable, but Maya was beginning to understand something important about the Institute's educational philosophy. These students were incredibly sophisticated in their thinking, capable of manipulating reality in ways that seemed like magic to human understanding. But their sophistication had made them dependent on advanced techniques for basic analysis. They'd learned to think about the universe as something that responded to consciousness and intention. Maya had learned to think about it as something that operated according to discoverable rules, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. The crisis came 3 days later, during what should have been a routine maintenance cycle for the Institute's primary power system. Maya was in the library, struggling with homework that required her to mathematically model the emotional resonance of prime numbers, when alarms began sounding throughout the facility. The Institute's communication system crackled to life with announcements in dozens of languages. The translation Maya received was stark. All students and faculty are to report to emergency stations immediately. The primary consciousness stabilization matrix has encountered critical instabilities. Academic activities are suspended pending resolution of the crisis. Maya had no idea what a consciousness stabilization matrix was, but the alarm tone suggested something serious was happening. She followed the flow of students toward what her emergency guide indicated were safe zones, but found herself increasingly curious about the nature of the crisis. The corridors were filled with beings displaying various forms of distress. Crystalline entities flickered with rapid color changes, gaseous forms, lost cohesion, and reformed repeatedly, and energy-based students fluctuated between bright and dim states. Professor Kethvar rushed past her, its geometric pattern cycling through configurations so rapidly they hurt to look at directly. Maya caught up with spiral harmony of ancient light in one of the main corridors. "What's a consciousness stabilization matrix?" she asked. "It is the system that maintains local reality coherence," Spiral Harmony replied, its usual cosmic beauty dimmed with what might have been anxiety. "The Institute exists partially in normal space and partially in conceptual dimensions. Without consciousness stabilization, the facility would lose structural integrity and collapse into dimensional paradox. So the building is held together by thinking, essentially. Yes, advanced civilizations often construct facilities that exist partially in mental space, allowing for impossible architectures and enhanced learning environments. However, such construction requires constant consciousness maintenance." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. The Institute wasn't just an advanced building, it was a thought experiment made manifest. A structure that existed because thousands of minds believed it should exist. And something had gone wrong with the system that kept those thoughts organized. What happens if they can't fix it? Spiral Harmony's cosmic arms dimmed to almost invisible. The Institute would cease to exist. All students and faculty would be lost in the dimensional collapse, scattered across parallel realities, with no way to return to normal space. Maya looked around at the panicking alien students and faculty, all presumably brilliant beyond human comprehension, and realized that none of them were moving toward the crisis. They were all heading for emergency stations to wait for someone else to solve the problem. Where is this consciousness stabilization matrix? In the core facility, 17 levels below the main academic complex. But Miss Chen, only beings with advanced consciousness manipulation abilities can work with such systems. The mathematics alone require 11-dimensional thinking. Maya was already heading toward the nearest access shaft that led downward. Maybe, but if it's a mechanical system, there might be something wrong that doesn't require consciousness manipulation to fix. Miss Chen, you cannot simply repair reality like a broken machine. But Maya was already gone, following emergency guide signs toward the Institute's engineering levels. Behind her, she could hear Spiral Harmony calling for security to stop the human from interfering with the crisis response. But the Institute's personnel seemed too busy with their own emergency protocols to pay attention to one primitive student heading in the wrong direction. The lower levels of the Institute were different from the elegant academic spaces above. Here, the walls were clearly mechanical rather than architectural art. covered in access panels and diagnostic displays that reminded Maya of the Starship engineering bays where she'd learned her trade. The core facility was a vast chamber filled with machinery that hurt to look at directly, devices that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, connected by conduits that carried what looked like liquid starlight. In the center of the chamber, a structure that defied geometric description pulsed with erratic patterns of light and energy. Maya could see the problem immediately. One of the primary power conduits had developed a resonance cascade, a feedback loop where energy reflected back and forth between components, building up to dangerous levels. She'd seen similar failures in Starship power systems during the war. The Institute's engineering team was clustered around control panels, trying to resolve the crisis through what appeared to be advanced mathematics and consciousness manipulation techniques. They were treating the symptoms rather than the cause, attempting to stabilize the consciousness matrix without addressing the underlying power fluctuation. Maya approached the lead engineer, a being that looked like a mobile constellation. "Excuse me, but I think your problem is in the power distribution system, not the consciousness matrix." The engineer turned toward her, its star patterns flickering with irritation. "Student, you should be in the emergency areas. This crisis requires advanced consciousness engineering, but the consciousness matrix is fine," Maya insisted. "Look at the energy flow patterns in that conduit." She pointed at the primary power feed. "You've got a standing wave resonance that's causing power fluctuations. The consciousness system is just responding to inconsistent energy input." "Impossible. Our diagnostic systems show no mechanical failures." Maya studied the control panels, trying to interpret alien engineering displays. The diagnostic systems were incredibly sophisticated, capable of analyzing quantum states and dimensional interactions, but they were designed to look for consciousness-based problems, not basic electrical engineering issues. "Your diagnostics are looking for the wrong type of problem," she said. "This is a frequency mismatch between your power source and your distribution network. The standing wave pattern. Student, your primitive understanding of power systems cannot comprehend the complexity of consciousness-based reality maintenance." Maya felt her temper rising. Around them, the Institute's structure was beginning to flicker between different architectural configurations as the consciousness stabilization matrix struggled with inconsistent power. Students and faculty were in real danger, and these engineers were too sophisticated to see a basic electrical problem. "Fine," Maya said. "Don't listen to me. But when your consciousness manipulation techniques fail and the Institute collapses into dimensional paradox, remember that you had a chance to fix the actual problem." She turned to leave, frustrated by the engineer's refusal to consider that their crisis might have a mundane solution. But as she reached the chamber entrance, spiral harmony of ancient light appeared in the doorway, along with Professor Zinthai and several other faculty members. "Miss Chen," Professor Zinthai said, "we have been informed that you believe you can assist with the current crisis. I tried. Your engineers aren't interested in hearing about power system failures from a primitive human." Professor Zinthai's energy form stabilized into a more solid configuration. "Miss Chen, earlier this week you demonstrated analytical capabilities that surprised us. While it seems unlikely that human engineering knowledge could resolve a consciousness stabilization crisis, our current methods are proving inadequate." Maya looked back at the failing system, where the engineers were now attempting increasingly desperate consciousness manipulation techniques. The power resonance was getting worse, and the Institute's structure was beginning to show signs of serious dimensional instability. "All right," she said, "but I need access to your power distribution controls, and I need your engineers to stop trying to fix the consciousness matrix until I can stabilize the power supply." The lead engineer's constellation pattern flared with indignation. "This is preposterous. A first-week student cannot possibly understand consciousness stabilization technology." "Maybe not," Maya replied, "but I understand power systems. And right now, your consciousness technology is failing because it's not getting clean power input." Professor Zinthai made what Maya interpreted as an executive decision. "Engineer Starweave, please provide Miss Chen with access to the power distribution controls. If her analysis is incorrect, we will have lost nothing. If she is correct, we may preserve the Institute." For the next 2 hours, Maya worked with tools designed for beings who manipulated matter with their thoughts rather than their hands. The interface was clumsy and frustrating, requiring her to describe what she wanted to do so the system could interpret her intentions. But gradually, she was able to identify and eliminate the resonance cascade that was causing the power fluctuations. The process involved techniques that were routine in human engineering but apparently unknown to galactic civilization: impedance matching, harmonic filtering, and feedback dampening. Maya had to explain each concept to engineers whose understanding of power systems was based on consciousness manipulation rather than electrical theory. "You see," she said, pointing at displays that showed power flow patterns. "When you have inconsistent frequencies in your distribution network, they create standing wave patterns that reflect energy back to the source. This creates a feedback loop that builds in intensity until something fails." Engineer Starweave's constellation pattern had dimmed to barely visible as it processed this information. "You are describing power transmission as a mechanical process rather than a consciousness-mediated phenomenon." "Because that's what it is," Maya replied. "Energy follows predictable laws regardless of whether anyone is thinking about it. You can manipulate it with consciousness, but the underlying principles don't change." As Maya implemented her solutions, the power fluctuations began to stabilize. The consciousness matrix, relieved of the inconsistent energy input that had been causing its instabilities, automatically returned to normal operation. The Institute's structure solidified back into its standard configuration, and the emergency alarms finally fell silent. In the sudden quiet of the core facility, Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Around her, the Institute's most advanced engineers stared at diagnostic displays that showed normal operation throughout all systems. "Extraordinary," Professor Zinthai said finally. "Miss Chen, you have resolved a crisis that our most sophisticated consciousness manipulation techniques could not address." "How is this possible?" Maya looked around at the beings who had spent lifetimes learning to manipulate reality with their minds, who could restructure matter at the atomic level through pure thought, who existed as living mathematics and organized energy. They were brilliant beyond anything human civilization had ever produced. They had just been saved by basic electrical engineering. "Sometimes," Maya said, "the solution to a complicated problem is a simple one. You just have to be looking in the right place." Word of Maya's success in resolving the consciousness stabilization crisis spread through the Institute faster than quantum entanglement communication. By the time she returned to her dormitory, Maya found a dozen messages waiting for her interview requests from academic journals, invitations to lecture at other institutions, and formal inquiries from several galactic engineering consortiums. The most surprising message came from academic coordinator HFY, the same being who had suggested she would be better suited for custodial work just weeks earlier. The holographic projection appeared as Maya was trying to process what had happened in the core facility. "Miss Chen," HFY said, its ethereal form somehow managing to convey embarrassment despite having no recognizable facial features. "I believe I owe you an apology. Your unconventional approach to problem-solving has proven more valuable than our initial assessments indicated." Maya settled into her desk chair, still wearing the maintenance coveralls she'd borrowed from the core facility. "Are you saying you might have been wrong about human cognitive limitations?" "I am saying that perhaps we have been evaluating intelligence using incomplete criteria. Your species appears to possess analytical capabilities that our standard testing methods do not adequately measure." That was probably the closest thing to an admission of error Maya was likely to get from the Institute's administration. "So what happens now? Are you going to kick me out for making your engineers look bad?" "Quite the contrary. The Institute's governing council has voted to offer you advanced placement in several technical disciplines. Professor Kethvar has requested that you be allowed to audit advanced dimensional engineering courses. Dr. Nelvey wishes to include you in experimental consciousness matter interaction studies. And Engineer Starwave has formally requested that you be assigned to assist with Institute infrastructure maintenance." Maya blinked. "Advanced placement?" A week ago, these same beings had been treating her like a promising pet that might eventually learn basic tricks. Now they wanted her in advanced classes? "I appreciate the offers," Maya said carefully. "But I'm not sure I understand what changed. I fixed a power distribution problem. It wasn't exactly revolutionary physics." HFY's form flickered with what Maya was beginning to recognize as thoughtful consideration. "Miss Chen, you resolved in hours a crisis that our most advanced consciousness engineers could not address, using techniques developed over millennia. More significantly, You identified the true nature of the problem when our sophisticated diagnostic systems failed to do so. This suggests that human analytical methods may offer perspectives that galactic civilization has overlooked. After HFY's projection disappeared, Maya sat in her small room trying to understand what had actually happened. She hadn't done anything particularly brilliant, she'd just applied basic engineering principles to a power system failure. The fact that the Institute's engineers hadn't recognized a resonance cascade suggested they'd become so focused on advanced techniques that they'd forgotten fundamental principles. It reminded her of something her old squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, used to say, "When you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. When you've got a whole toolbox, you can choose the right tool for each job." The Institute's engineers were incredibly sophisticated hammers. Maya was beginning to realize that humans might be toolboxes. The next morning brought changes that made Maya's head spin. Her schedule had been completely revised. Instead of remedial courses, she was now enrolled in advanced practical systems analysis, multi-dimensional problem-solving applications, and theoretical foundations of physical reality. Her professors had apparently decided that if human thinking could resolve consciousness stabilization crises, they wanted to understand how it worked. Her first class was Advanced Practical Systems Analysis, taught by Professor Kethvar, in a laboratory that looked more like a three-dimensional puzzle than a classroom. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered in mechanical systems of every description, devices that defied geometric logic, machines that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously, and apparatus that appeared to be powered by pure mathematics. Today, Professor Kethvar announced to a class that was significantly smaller and more advanced than Maya's previous remedial courses, "We will examine the analytical methods demonstrated by student Chen during yesterday's crisis. Specifically, we will attempt to understand how primitive observational techniques can identify system failures that escape sophisticated diagnostic methods." Maya felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The other students were clearly advanced beings whose species were known for their technological sophistication and analytical capabilities. She was the only human in a class designed for the galaxy's intellectual elite. "Miss Chen," Professor Kethvar continued, "would you please examine this system and provide your analysis of its operational status?" The professor gestured toward a complex arrangement of crystalline components connected by energy conduits that pulsed with different colors of light. Maya approached the device cautiously, aware that she was being tested in front of beings who could probably calculate the system's quantum states just by thinking about them. Maya started with the basics, following energy flow patterns, looking for signs of stress or wear, checking connection points for instability. The system was incredibly complex, but the principles were familiar. Energy went in, was processed through various stages, and emerged as something. She wasn't sure what the device was supposed to do, but she could see how it was supposed to work. "The third stage processing unit has a harmonic mismatch with the primary input feed," she said after several minutes of examination. "Look at the way the energy pulse pattern changes as it enters that crystalline matrix. The frequency isn't being properly stepped down, which is causing resonance buildup in the downstream components." Professor Kethvar's geometric form went completely still. "Student Chen, how did you determine frequency mismatch without quantum-level analysis?" Maya pointed at the energy conduits. "Watch the light patterns in the connecting pathways. See how the pulses are slightly out of sync? That's a frequency mismatch. The downstream components are having to work harder to process energy that doesn't match their operational parameters." One of the other students, a being that looked like a mobile crystalline tree, spoke up. "But frequency mismatch can only be detected through harmonic analysis calculations that require instruments," Maya interrupted. "But if you know what to look for, you can see the effects with your eyes. The system is telling you what's wrong if you pay attention to what it's doing, rather than what you think it should be doing." Professor Kethvar activated what Maya assumed were quantum diagnostic tools, devices that filled the air with shimmering displays of mathematical equations and multi-dimensional analysis charts. After several minutes of computation, the professor's form began cycling through rapid pattern changes. "Student Chen is correct," Professor Kethvar announced. "The third stage processing unit is indeed operating at incorrect harmonic frequencies. Our standard diagnostic protocols did not detect this failure because they were analyzing quantum coherence rather than basic energy transmission parameters." The crystalline tree student rustled with what might have been confusion. But why would basic energy transmission affect quantum coherence? Advanced systems are designed to transcend such primitive limitations. Maya looked around the room at beings whose understanding of technology was so advanced that they'd forgotten how energy actually moved through physical systems, because quantum effects still depend on classical physics for their foundation. You can't have stable quantum coherence if your basic energy transmission is unstable. Extraordinary, Professor Kethvar said. Student Chen, you appear to think of advanced systems as extensions of fundamental principles, rather than transcendence of them. Because that's what they are, Maya replied. You can't violate the laws of physics, you can only use them more cleverly. A system that manipulates consciousness or reality still has to obey conservation of energy and basic mechanical principles. For the rest of the class, Maya found herself explaining concepts that she'd considered elementary to beings whose civilizations had achieved technological marvels that defied human understanding. How energy flowed through systems, how mechanical stress accumulated over time, how resonance patterns could amplify small problems into catastrophic failures. The alien students took notes with the intensity of scholars discovering a new branch of mathematics. Maya began to realize that galactic civilization had become so sophisticated that they'd lost touch with the fundamental principles their advanced technologies were built upon. Her next class, Multidimensional Problem-Solving Applications, was taught by Dr. Neldy and focused on practical applications of consciousness manipulation techniques. Maya had expected to be completely out of her depth, but found herself approaching the problems from directions that surprised both her professor and classmates. Today we will examine a practical scenario, Dr. Neldy announced. A research station in the Andromeda Galaxy has reported equipment failures that appear to be caused by local space-time distortions. Standard consciousness manipulation techniques have proven ineffective. How would you resolve this crisis? The other students immediately began suggesting increasingly complex, consciousness-based solutions. Reality anchoring techniques, dimensional stabilization fields, quantum consciousness realignment procedures. Each suggestion was more sophisticated than the last, requiring advanced mental abilities that had taken centuries for their species to develop. Maya raised her hand. Before we start with consciousness manipulation, shouldn't we figure out what's actually causing the space-time distortions? Dr. Neldy's probability cloud flickered with interest. An intriguing perspective. How would you determine the cause? The same way you'd troubleshoot any system failure, gather data, identify patterns, trace the problem to its source. Space-time distortions don't just happen randomly. Something has to be causing them. One of the students, a being that existed as organized plasma, rippled with what might have been dismissal. But determining causation requires extensive sensor networks and computational analysis. Consciousness manipulation can directly address the effects without needing to understand underlying mechanisms. But if you don't fix the cause, the effects will just come back, Maya pointed out. It's like treating a fever without figuring out what infection is causing it. You might temporarily reduce the temperature, but the patient is still sick. Dr. Neldy's form became more solid as the professor focused intently on Maya's words. Student Chen, you are suggesting that consciousness manipulation treats symptoms rather than causes? Sometimes. Look, consciousness manipulation is incredibly powerful. I've seen what you can all do. But it's still just another tool. Sometimes the right tool is advanced consciousness techniques. Sometimes it's basic troubleshooting and mechanical repair. For the next hour, Maya found herself defending the radical proposition that some problems might have simple, non-consciousness-based solutions. Her classmates seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept that advanced beings might occasionally benefit from primitive analytical approaches. The pattern repeated in her third class, Theoretical Foundations of Physical Reality, where Maya discovered that galactic civilization's understanding of physics was simultaneously more advanced and more limited than human science. They could manipulate matter at the quantum level, restructure space-time through focused intention, and exist as pure energy or mathematical concepts. But they'd never developed a unified understanding of how consciousness-based and mechanical systems interacted. Professor Verith posed theoretical scenarios that required students to analyze reality from multiple logical frameworks simultaneously. Maya found herself approaching each problem by first establishing which framework was most appropriate for each aspect, then building comprehensive solutions that integrated different approaches. Fascinating, Professor Vareth said after Maya had presented a solution that combined binary logic with probability mathematics and temporal analysis. Student Chen, you appear to treat logical frameworks as complementary tools rather than competing philosophies. Because they are, Maya said. Each logical system is good for certain types of problems. You use the one that fits the situation, or combine them if the situation is complex enough to require multiple approaches. But how do you determine which framework is appropriate without first analyzing the problem using metalogical principles? Maya thought about explaining troubleshooting methodology to a being made of living mathematics. You look at what kind of problem you're dealing with. If it's a yes or no question, you use binary logic. If it involves probability and uncertainty, you use probability logic. If timing matters, you include temporal analysis. You match the tool to the job. Professor Vareth's crystalline form went through a series of rapid pattern changes that Maya was beginning to recognize as intense processing. Student Chen, you describe logic as practical methodology rather than philosophical framework. This suggests a fundamentally different relationship between consciousness and reasoning. By the end of the day, Maya was exhausted. She'd spent 8 hours explaining concepts she'd considered basic to beings whose intelligence was measured on scales that didn't include human thinking. More confusingly, they seemed to find her explanations genuinely valuable. That evening, Maya was studying in her room when spiral harmony of ancient light appeared at her door. The cosmic being's usual ethereal beauty was dimmed with what Maya was learning to recognize as deep thoughtfulness. Maya, Spiral Harmony said, I must ask you something that may seem strange. Do you believe that consciousness creates reality, or that reality exists independently of consciousness? Maya looked up from her homework and assignment to analyze a complex multidimensional system using 12 different logical frameworks simultaneously. Does it matter? What do you mean? Well, whether consciousness creates reality or just observes it, we still have to deal with the reality we experience. If I'm fixing a broken hyperdrive, it doesn't matter whether the hyperdrive exists because I'm thinking about it or because it just exists. I still have to make it work properly. Spiral Harmony's cosmic arms brightened with what might have been excitement. But that is precisely the point. You treat reality as something that must be engaged with rather than something that can be controlled through consciousness alone. Because that's what works, Maya said simply. I mean, consciousness manipulation is amazing. I've seen what you can all do. But sometimes reality doesn't care what you're thinking. Sometimes you have to work with what's actually there. Maya, I believe you have identified something that galactic civilization has overlooked in our pursuit of advanced consciousness techniques. We have become so focused on transcending physical limitations that we have forgotten the value of understanding and working with those limitations. Maya closed her homework assignment and gave Spiral Harmony her full attention. What do you mean? Consider yesterday's crisis. Our engineers spent hours trying to impose consciousness-based solutions on what was ultimately a mechanical problem. They